She hid her illness for 6 months to protect their love, but her silence almost destroyed the very thing she was trying to save. Ryan sat in the corner booth of the small coffee shop, the same place where he and Lisa had been meeting every week for the past 3 years. The afternoon sun came through the window, making patterns on the wooden table between them. But something felt different today. He could sense it in the way Lisa held her coffee cup, her fingers gripping it a little too tight. She hadn't looked at him properly since she sat down, and that wasn't like her at all. They'd been together long enough that Ryan could read her moods pretty well. He knew when she was tired from work, when she was stressed about family stuff, or when she just needed some quiet time. But this was something else. There was a heaviness in the air that made his stomach feel tight. Lisa kept opening her mouth like she wanted to say something, then closing it again. She stirred her coffee even though she'd already added sugar 5 minutes ago. Finally, she put the spoon down and looked up at him. Her eyes were a bit red, like maybe she'd been crying earlier. "Do you want to know what I didn't tell you?" she asked softly. Her voice was barely above a whisper. And Ryan had to lean forward to hear her properly. His heart started beating faster. A million thoughts ran through his mind in that moment. Was she seeing someone else? Did she want to break up? Had something bad happened to someone in her family? He wasn't sure he wanted to know. But he also couldn't not know. He nodded slowly, trying to keep his face calm, even though his insides felt like they were twisting. Lisa took a deep breath, the kind people take when they're about to jump into cold water. She started talking, and what came out wasn't anything Ryan had expected. 6 months ago, she told him, she'd gone to the doctor because she was feeling tired all the time. She thought it was just stress from her job at the school where she taught. But the tests came back, showing something more serious. She had a chronic condition, something that would be with her for the rest of her life. It wasn't immediately dangerous, but it needed to be managed carefully with medication and regular checkups. Ryan felt like the floor had dropped out from under him. 6 months? She'd known for 6 months and never said anything? He tried to process what she was telling him, but his mind kept getting stuck on that one fact. Half a year of keeping this secret, of dealing with it alone. All those times she'd canceled their plans, saying she was too tired, all those evenings when she seemed distant, and he'd worried that maybe she was losing interest in their relationship. The doctor appointments she'd mentioned casually, saying they were just routine checkups. It all made sense now, but in the worst possible way. Lisa kept talking, explaining how scared she'd been when she first got the diagnosis, how she'd sat in her car in the hospital parking lot for an hour, just crying and not knowing what to do. She talked about starting the medication, dealing with the side effects, learning to manage her energy levels. She'd been doing all of this alone, and Ryan felt a strange mix of emotions washing over him. Part of him was hurt that she hadn't trusted him enough to share this. Part of him was angry that she'd shut him out of something so important. But mostly, he just felt sad. Sad for her, for what she'd been going through. Sad for them, for all the time they'd lost to this secret. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Why would you go through this alone?" Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She explained that she didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want him to look at her differently, to see her as sick or broken. They'd been so happy, making plans for the future, talking about maybe moving in together next year. She was afraid that if she told him, everything would change. He'd start treating her like she was fragile. Or worse, he might decide that a relationship with someone who had health problems wasn't what he wanted. Ryan sat back in his chair, trying to take it all in. He looked at Lisa, really looked at her, and suddenly saw all the small signs he'd missed. The way she'd lost a bit of weight, the new pills he'd noticed in her bag once, which she'd said were just vitamins. The fact that she'd been going to bed earlier whenever she stayed at his place. How had he not seen it? Or had he seen it and just not wanted to ask? The coffee shop buzzed with other people's conversations around them. Normal afternoon chatter that felt strange against the weight of their moment. Ryan reached across the table, wanting to take Lisa's hand, but then pulled back, unsure. Everything felt uncertain now. He wanted to say the right thing, to make her feel better. But he didn't know what the right thing was. Should he be supportive? Should he be honest about feeling hurt? Could he be both? Lisa wiped her eyes with a napkin, trying to compose herself. She told him she'd understand if this was too much, if he needed time to think about things. That made Ryan feel even worse somehow. Like she'd already decided that he might leave, that he might not be able to handle this. Did she really think so little of him, or was this about her own fear more than anything else? They sat there for a long time, neither knowing quite what to say next. The confession had been made, the secret was out. But now they had to figure out what came after. Ryan's mind was racing with questions, concerns, and a deep sadness for the months Lisa had spent carrying this alone. The days after that coffee shop meeting were some of the strangest Ryan had ever experienced. He and Lisa had parted ways that afternoon without really resolving anything. She'd said she needed to get home, and he'd nodded, still too shocked to know what he was feeling. They'd hugged awkwardly before going their separate ways, and Ryan had driven home in a daze, barely remembering the route. That night, he couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment from the past 6 months. How many times had he complained about work stress to Lisa while she was dealing with something so much bigger? How many times had he been annoyed when she canceled plans, thinking she just didn't want to spend time with him? The guilt started creeping in. Even though logically he knew he couldn't have known what he wasn't told. He wanted to call her, to talk things through, but every time he picked up his phone, he didn't know what to say. Sorry felt inadequate. Are you okay felt stupid after 6 months of her not being okay. I love you felt like it might be too much pressure when she was clearly struggling. So he ended up sending nothing. And his silence grew longer with each passing day. Lisa, on her end, was going through her own confusion. She'd finally told Ryan the truth, thinking it would bring relief. But instead, she felt worse. His shock and hurt had been clear on his face, and now his silence felt like confirmation of her worst fears. He was pulling away, probably trying to figure out how to end things gently. She'd seen it coming, hadn't she? That's why she'd kept the secret in the first place. Better to have had those 6 months of normal happiness than to have spent them watching him slowly check out of the relationship. Her sister called one evening, and Lisa ended up crying on the phone for over an hour. The whole story came out, including parts she hadn't told Ryan, like how she'd been offered a really good teaching position in another city, a chance to work at one of the best schools in the region. The interview had gone perfectly, and they'd wanted her to start in 3 months. But by then, she'd gotten her diagnosis and knew she needed to stay close to her doctors, her support system. So she'd turned it down without even telling Ryan it had been an option. When her sister asked why she hadn't at least discussed it with Ryan, Lisa didn't have a good answer. They'd been talking about moving together, finding a place in a new city where they could both find good jobs. It had been their dream for over a year, but she'd made the decision alone, letting the opportunity pass by, telling herself it was for the best. Now she wondered if she'd been protecting Ryan, or just protecting herself from having to be vulnerable. Ryan found out about the job from Lisa's sister completely by accident. He'd run into her at the grocery store, and she'd mentioned something about it being such a shame that Lisa had to turn down that amazing school position. Ryan had stood there in the middle of the store, holding a basket of groceries, feeling like he'd been punched in the stomach. Another secret. Another decision made without him. It wasn't just about the illness anymore. It was about trust, about partnership, about whether they were actually building a life together or just living parallel lives that occasionally intersected. That night, he did call Lisa, and it didn't go well. He tried to stay calm, but his hurt and frustration came through anyway. Why hadn't she told him about the job? They could have figured something out. Maybe they could have moved together, found her new doctors there. Maybe the opportunity was worth the challenge. But she'd decided for both of them, without even giving him a chance to be part of the conversation. Lisa got defensive, her own hurt and fear turning into anger. She'd been trying to be practical, she said. Trying not to derail his career with her problems. He had his own job to think about. His own life. She wasn't going to be the person who held him back. Ryan argued back, saying that she didn't get to make those choices for him. If he wanted to support her, to adjust his plans, that should be his decision to make. The conversation ended badly, with both of them saying things they'd regret later. Lisa said maybe they needed different things from a relationship. Ryan said maybe she was right. They hung up angry and hurt, and didn't talk for several days after that. During that week of silence, both of them were miserable. Ryan went to work, came home, and sat alone in his apartment, wondering how everything had fallen apart so quickly. Lisa taught her classes, smiled at her students, and then went home to cry. They'd gone from being happy and planning a future to barely speaking, and neither knew how to fix it. Ryan's mom noticed something was wrong when he came over for their usual Sunday dinner. He was quiet, picking at his food, clearly somewhere else in his mind. Eventually, he told her everything. His mom listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she asked him a simple question that he couldn't easily answer. "Do you love her?" "Yes," he said immediately. "Then why are you sitting here instead of fighting for that?" Ryan spent the next few days doing something he'd never done before. He started researching Lisa's condition, reading everything he could find about it: medical websites, patient forums, articles about treatment options, and lifestyle adjustments. He learned about the fatigue she must be feeling, the medication side effects, the emotional toll of being diagnosed with something chronic. The more he read, the more he understood just how scared she must have been. One evening, he found himself on a support group website for partners of people with chronic illnesses. He hesitated before joining, feeling almost like he was intruding on something private. But he created an account and started reading through the posts. The stories there were eye-opening. Partners talking about their struggles to support loved ones. People discussing how their relationships had changed after a diagnosis. The fear, the adjustment period, the learning curve of becoming a caregiver while still being a partner. One post in particular stuck with him. A woman had written about how her husband's illness had initially pushed them apart because she'd tried to be strong and handle everything herself. She'd thought she was protecting him by not showing how scared she was. But eventually, they'd learned that being partners meant sharing the burden, not carrying it alone. The parallels to his and Lisa's situation were striking. Ryan started attending an in-person support group that met on Tuesday evenings at a community center across town. He felt awkward at first, being there for a relationship that might already be over. But people welcomed him kindly, and he found that just listening to others helped him process his own feelings. He heard from people who'd made their relationships work despite serious health challenges. He also heard from some whose relationships hadn't survived. And what he noticed was that the difference often came down to communication and mutual support. Meanwhile, Lisa was doing her own work. Her doctor had suggested therapy months ago when she first got diagnosed, but she'd brushed it off, thinking she could handle things on her own. After the fight with Ryan, though, she finally made an appointment. Her therapist was a kind older woman who didn't push too hard but asked questions that made Lisa really think about her patterns. In their sessions, Lisa started to recognize that her need to handle everything alone wasn't new. It had been there her whole life. This idea that asking for help was weakness. She'd been that way as a kid, struggling through homework rather than asking her parents for help. In college, she'd worked 2 jobs instead of accepting her family's offer of financial support. And now, with the biggest challenge of her life, she'd reverted to that same pattern. Independence had always felt like strength to her, but maybe it was actually fear in disguise. Her therapist asked her to consider what message she was sending to Ryan by shutting him out. Did she think he wasn't capable of supporting her? Did she not trust him to make his own choices about their relationship? Or was she perhaps protecting herself from the vulnerability of needing someone and them potentially letting her down? That last question hit hard, because Lisa recognized the truth in it. If she never fully leaned on Ryan, then he couldn't fail to catch her. Both Ryan and Lisa were working through their issues separately, neither knowing that the other was doing similar emotional work. They'd see each other's names pop up on their phones and want to reach out, but neither knew how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. The hurt was still too fresh, and pride kept getting in the way of making the first move. Lisa's best friend finally forced the issue one weekend. She showed up at Lisa's apartment with coffee and refused to leave until Lisa talked. "You're both miserable," her friend pointed out. "And you're both too stubborn to make the first move. But here's the thing. You know he loves you. Right?" Lisa nodded, tears starting again. "And you love him?" Another nod. "Then stop being stupid and talk to him." It wasn't quite that simple, but her friend's directness helped. Lisa realized she'd been waiting for Ryan to reach out, to prove that he still wanted to be with her despite everything. But that wasn't fair. She was the one who'd kept secrets. She was the one who'd made unilateral decisions about their future. If anyone needed to make the first move toward reconciliation, it was her. Ryan was dealing with his own pushes toward action. His support group had been encouraging him to communicate, to be honest about his feelings, but also to listen to Lisa's perspective. One of the members, an older man who'd been caring for his wife for 15 years, told Ryan something that stuck with him. Love isn't about never being hurt or disappointed. It's about deciding that the person is worth working through the hurt with. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, nearly 2 months after that initial coffee shop confession, Ryan made a decision. He texted Lisa asking if they could meet. Not at the coffee shop this time, that place held too much tension now. Instead, he suggested the park where they'd first met 4 years ago, when Lisa had been reading on a bench and Ryan had asked if he could share it because everywhere else was crowded. Lisa's heart jumped when she saw his message. She'd been hoping for this but also dreading it. What if this was him, wanting to officially end things? What if he'd spent these weeks realizing he didn't want a relationship with someone who had health problems? But she agreed to meet anyway, because not knowing was worse than any answer he might give. The park was quiet when they met that weekend, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet as they walked. Neither spoke at first. Both nervous. Both carrying the weight of everything unsaid between them. Finally, they sat on that same bench where they'd met, watching the ducks swim in the pond, gathering courage for the conversation they needed to have. Ryan spoke first. His voice quiet but steady. He told Lisa about the support groups he'd been attending, the research he'd done, the conversations with his mom. He admitted that his first reaction had been hurt and anger, and those feelings were real and valid. Being shut out of something so important had wounded him deeply, but he'd also come to understand, at least partially, why she'd done it. Fear made people do things that didn't always make sense from the outside. Lisa listened, tears already streaming down her face. She hadn't known he'd been doing all that work to understand her situation. Part of her felt guilty that he'd had to do it alone, but another part felt touched that he'd cared enough to try to understand rather than just walking away. When Ryan paused, Lisa took her turn. She apologized for keeping secrets, for making decisions without him, for not trusting him enough to share the burden. She explained the shame she'd felt when she got the diagnosis. In her mind, she'd become the sick girlfriend, a burden rather than a partner. She'd imagined Ryan staying with her out of obligation, pity, or guilt, and that thought had been unbearable. So she'd tried to manage everything herself, to prove that nothing had to change, that she could still be the person he'd fallen in love with. "But that's just it," Ryan said, turning to look at her directly. "I fell in love with you. The real you. Not some perfect version who never has problems or needs help. Everyone has stuff they're dealing with. Everyone needs support sometimes. That's what being together is supposed to mean." Lisa nodded, understanding but still struggling. She told him about the therapy sessions, about recognizing her patterns of isolation and self-reliance. She was working on it, she promised. But it was hard to change habits she'd had her whole life. Learning to be vulnerable, to ask for help, to trust someone else with her well-being, it all felt terrifying in a way that even the diagnosis hadn't. They talked about the job she'd turned down, and this part was harder. Ryan admitted he felt betrayed by that decision being made without him. They'd spent months talking about moving together, planning their future, and she'd let a huge opportunity slip away without even mentioning it. Lisa explained that at the time, it had seemed like the only logical choice. New city, new doctors, new support system, all while trying to manage a new diagnosis. It had felt overwhelming and impossible. But what if it wasn't impossible? Ryan asked. What if we could have figured it out together? Maybe it would have been hard, but maybe it would have been worth it. You didn't give me the chance to even try. Thanks for watching. I'm into the 40. Lisa had to sit with that truth. He was right. She'd been so focused on protecting him from difficulty that she'd actually excluded him from their shared life. In trying to be less of a burden, she'd made unilateral choices that affected them both. That wasn't partnership. That was just two people living separate lives that happened to overlap sometimes. They discussed her health in more practical terms then. Ryan asked questions he'd been afraid to ask before. What was her prognosis? What did daily management look like? Were there things that would get harder as time went on? Lisa answered honestly, relieved to finally be open about it. Yes, she'd have good days and bad days. Yes. She'd need to be careful about not overextending herself. Yes, there would probably be times when she needed his help, his patience, his understanding. I want to be there for those times, Ryan said firmly. That's what I'm trying to tell you. I'm not scared off by this. I'm hurt that you didn't think I could handle it, but I'm not going anywhere because things got difficult. They talked about trust, about what it meant to really be partners. Lisa admitted that she'd never fully trusted anyone with her vulnerabilities before. Her family loved her, but she'd always been the capable one, the one who had things together. Her friends were supportive, but she kept them at a certain distance emotionally. Ryan was the first person she'd ever really let in, and that had made the diagnosis feel even more threatening. What if needing help made him see her differently? Ryan shared his own fears too. He was scared of not being enough, of not knowing how to help properly, of saying or doing the wrong thing. The support groups had helped him see that those fears were normal, that being a supportive partner didn't mean having all the answers. It meant showing up, being willing to learn, and not running away when things got complicated. As the sun started to set over the pond, casting orange light across the water, they made some agreements. No more big secrets. No more unilateral decisions about things that affected them both. If something was hard or scary, they'd talk about it rather than handling it alone. It wouldn't be perfect. They both acknowledged that. Old habits were hard to break, and there would probably be times when one of them reverted to old patterns. But they'd try, and they'd call each other out gently when it happened. Lisa asked Ryan if he thought they could really rebuild trust after everything that had happened. He was quiet for a moment, thinking about it seriously. Then he said that trust wasn't like a vase that shattered and couldn't be put back together. It was more like a muscle that needed to be exercised and strengthened over time. They'd taken some damage, sure, but they could rebuild if they both committed to the work. I'm committed, Lisa said softly. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us. I'm committed too, Ryan replied. And this time when he reached for her hand, she took it without hesitation. They sat there on the bench as evening fell, holding hands and feeling like maybe, just maybe, they could find their way through this together. The months that followed weren't easy, but they were honest, and that made all the difference. Ryan and Lisa established new patterns in their relationship, built on communication and mutual support rather than trying to protect each other from difficulty. They had a weekly check-in, usually over dinner, where they'd talk about how they were both really doing. Not just surface-level fine, but actual feelings, struggles, needs. Lisa's health became something they managed together. Ryan started going to her doctor appointments when his schedule allowed. Not to take over or hover, but to understand and support. He learned about her medication schedule, the warning signs when she was pushing herself too hard, the difference between good tired and bad tired. Lisa, for her part, got better at asking for help when she needed it. Small things at first, like letting Ryan cook dinner when she was exhausted, or canceling plans without feeling guilty when her body needed rest. There were still bumps along the way. One evening, about 3 months in, Lisa made plans to deep clean her entire apartment despite having had a long week at work. Ryan came over to find her exhausted and frustrated, pushing through when she clearly needed to stop. They had a conversation about it. Gentle but firm. This was the old pattern showing up again, trying to prove she didn't need help. that she could handle everything. Lisa recognized it once, he pointed it out and agreed to rest, while Ryan ordered pizza. Ryan had his own learning moments too. There was a time when he got a bit overprotective, trying to manage Lisa's schedule and suggesting she cut back on work commitments. Lisa had to remind him that she knew her own limits. That supportive didn't mean controlling. He apologized and pulled back, recognizing that in his desire to help, he'd started treating her like she couldn't make her own decisions. Finding the balance between support and independence was an ongoing process for both of them. They made some practical changes too. Ryan took a new job at a different company, one that offered more flexible hours and better work-from-home options. It meant he could adjust his schedule when Lisa needed support without having to choose between his career and their relationship. The pay was slightly less, but the quality of life improvement was worth it. Lisa appreciated the gesture but made sure he understood it was his choice, not an obligation. The question of moving came up again, but differently this time. They discussed it openly, weighing pros and cons together. Eventually, they decided to stay in their current city for now. Lisa's medical team was here. They had a support system of friends and family, and stability felt important while they were still adjusting to the new reality of managing her condition. But they didn't close the door completely. Maybe in a few years, when things were more settled, they could revisit the idea. The difference was that now it was a joint decision, made together with both their needs considered. Lisa continued with therapy, finding it more helpful than she'd expected. Her therapist helped her work through not just the health diagnosis but the deeper patterns around vulnerability and control. She started to understand that her worth wasn't tied to her productivity or her independence. She could need help and still be strong. She could be struggling and still be valuable. Ryan kept attending his support group, even though things with Lisa had improved. He found value in the community there, in being able to share challenges and victories with people who understood. Sometimes Lisa would come with him to the meetings, which helped her feel less alone in dealing with her condition. Hearing others talk about their experiences normalized what they were going through and gave them strategies for handling difficult situations. 1 year after that first coffee shop confession, they found themselves back at the same corner booth. This time, it was Lisa's idea. A way of reclaiming that space and those memories. They ordered the same drinks they'd had that day, and Lisa looked at Ryan with clear eyes. "Thank you," she said, "for staying when I finally told you everything. And thank you for not letting me push you away." Ryan reached across the table and took her hand, something that felt natural now, rather than uncertain. "Thank you for eventually letting me in. For trusting me enough to be real. Even when it was scary." They talked about how much had changed in that year. Not just in their relationship, but in themselves as individuals. Lisa was more open, more willing to be vulnerable. Ryan was more patient, more understanding of complexity. They'd both learned that love wasn't about everything being perfect or easy. It was about choosing each other day after day, even when, and especially when, things got hard. Lisa's health had stabilized with treatment, though they both knew it would be something she managed for the rest of her life. Good days and bad days, as the doctors had said. But she'd learned to pace herself better, to listen to her body, to accept limitations without seeing them as failures. Ryan had learned to support without smothering, to be there without trying to fix everything. They'd started making new plans together, smaller and more realistic than their previous dreams but no less meaningful. Maybe they'd get a dog next year. Maybe they'd take that vacation they'd been talking about. Maybe, eventually, they'd move in together. All maybes, all discussed openly, all decided together. As they left the coffee shop that afternoon, walking out into the sunshine hand in hand, both of them felt something they hadn't felt in a long time. Hope, not the naive hope that everything would be easy, but the grounded hope that comes from having weathered a storm and found yourself still standing. Together, their relationship wasn't perfect. They still had disagreements, still had moments of frustration or miscommunication, but they had built something stronger than what they'd had before, something based on honesty, trust, and the understanding that being partners meant facing life together, whatever it brought. The secret that had almost destroyed them had ultimately taught them how to truly be together. And that, they both agreed, was worth everything they'd been through.